The Nigerian government is headed for a legal showdown in courts next year over an $11 billion arbitration award won by Process and Industrial Developments Limited, also known as P&ID. Nigeria claims that the judiciary was financially induced and manipulated to grant victory in the company's favor. The country also alleges two men who owned and worked for P&ID obtained privileged and/or confidential documents about the government's entry into the 2010 gas deal, its strategy for defense, and discussions about striking a settlement. P&ID has denied the allegations and accuses Nigeria of evading its legal obligation to compensate the Virgin British Islands company. If the government case fails, President Buhari's successor may be forced back to the negotiating table with P&ID. Joining me from Nigeria, from Abuja, Nigeria, that is Dr. Muda Yusuf. He is the CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise and a former Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, LCCI. Dr. Yusuf, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
So let's start at the beginning of this particular case. It's quite a complex and multi-layered one, but in January of 2010, Nigeria signed the gas processing contract with P&ID, and then 2 years later, the company began the arbitration process alleging breach of contract. In July of 2015, a London tribunal gave judgment in favor of the company, and in January 2017, the final award then was $6.6 billion with an interest rate of 7% pre and post judgment. So there are a number of things I've skipped in between, but I want you to fill in the blanks for me. So from the beginning, there were issues with this particular contract that was awarded. Where did the red flags in this situation begin?
Yeah, the challenge, I think, is about processes and procedures, especially in our public sector. And all of these are reflections of how weak our institutions are and how corrupt our public institutions are generally. This is what is being reflected. Because the culture of public officials looking at every agreement, every project, from the point of view of what is in need for them, is what has brought us into this. Apparently, due diligence was not carried out. The processes were compromised. People took bribe and all of that. And a whole lot of these kind of things happen at various degrees. This is just making headlines because of the amount and because the thing is international. But a whole lot of things happen where people just compromise the processes for personal interest at the expense of the country. This is what is playing out here. And the lesson here is that we should strengthen our institutions and we should ensure that there are consequences for this kind of infractions. There are so many agreements like that, even agreements involving privatization, concessioning, all sorts of funny agreements that are signed. It has left many projects moribund. People cannibalize, they cannibalize government assets, go to court, eventually to walk away. You know? So it is a country that suffers from all of this. So it's an institutional thing, and it's also an indication of the weakness of our institutions, an indication of the level of corruption in public service, and also the flag is that we need to strengthen our processes and procedures and ensure that before anybody commits the country to any contract or any agreement, whether privatization, concession, all these processes, there has to be due diligence. And if anything goes wrong, people need to be held accountable.
So I want to pick up on a few of the points you've mentioned as you've answered that first question. And so you've raised the issue. Let's go further into that. So one of the many issues that have been raised in this case also concerns Nigeria's what people have described now as habitual disregard for the sanctity of contracts and terms of agreement, and the failure of Nigeria's representatives in many cases to enter into agreements that are in the best interest of the country. So let's look specifically at Clause 20 of this gas supply and processing agreement with P&ID, which sets up the arbitration process. There was an attempt to negotiate an $850 million settlement payable in installments, but eventually that fell through, and the arbitration tribunal in London ruled that Nigeria had breached the contract and failed to perform its own obligations. It's also interesting, of course, that P&ID has yet to have built that plant that's in question. But beyond that, let's look at this in terms of the process that was set about for the dispute situation. And I would hope we'd be able to get the explainer on that on the screen quickly. But when you look at the dispute process in this contract, particularly something that would need to be right, equitable, and fair for the interest of Nigerians, do you think Clause 20 really carried that for the country?
No, I don't think so. There are two issues here. There are the legal issues. There are also the moral issues. Now, of course, some guys have, committed us in a contractual agreement. But the morality of the agreement also is an issue. I think that is where there was a London Court of Arbitration that at least awarded something in favor of Nigeria, to say that Nigeria has proven a prima facie case that the contract in the first place was committed to fraudulently. So on one hand, you can argue that, okay, it's legally binding, but the quality of the contract and the processes leading to the contractual agreement was also defective, because it was established that the prima facie case of bribery and corrupted processes led to the contract in the first place. I think it was at that stage that Nigeria got that reprieve, to be able to engage and appeal this judgment payment that has been got, and that is where we are. So there are the legal issues, there are also the moral issues, there are issues of compromise, there are issues of corruption that have been loaded into the contract. Because law and justice are sometimes not the same thing. But law must deliver justice. And that is why I think at the level of the first appeal that the Nigerian laws, to discover that even though there may be some legal arguments, but there are issues of justice as to the quality of that contractual agreement. I think that is where we are.
Okay, so as we move forward now, we know that Nigeria has filed new court documents, made a number of allegations, and also, of course, raised a number of questions. But right now, legally, Nigeria is supposedly owing P&ID $11 billion, which comes from the initial award of the $6.6 billion and then added interest. In court documents, Nigeria is raising a number of questions, particularly related to Nigerian officials and individuals related to collusion. So you've mentioned, of course, corruption and bribery. Dr. Yusuf, take us deeper. What are the allegations that Nigeria is really making now against P&ID?
The allegation is that first, this amount they are requesting is outrageous. Second is that the agreement itself in the first place was fraudulently procured. And as you know, even some Nigerians, some officials are already in court in Nigeria on account of their being involved in this. I'm not sure maybe one or two have even been jailed. I don't have the full fact. But they are in court because of their involvement in procuring this. So the position of Nigeria is that first, even if you have to pay anything, it doesn't have to be this outrageous, because of the quality of the agreement in the first place. Because the agreement was fraudulently procured. And in law, I think there has to be morality, there has to be justice. That is where we are. And the final decision is yet to be taken. Because, as you know, Nigeria has appealed. And very soon the appeal will come up. The court has agreed that a prima facie case has been established by Nigeria on this matter. So that means there's some merit in the argument of the Nigerian government.
So let's pick up from where you said the country pays in regards to how these situations pay out. Unfortunately, the P&ID case is not the first, and it may not be the last case in which Nigeria finds itself facing trial or judgment when it comes to contracts both locally and internationally. There are a host of examples both from the states and the federal government. How does Nigeria's behavior when it comes to such contracts affect the country in terms of the economy, and even affects the country in terms of reputation on the international scene?
It has a very huge reputational cost. It's not good for our country risk rating, because all of these things contribute to country risk assessment. It's not good for the confidence of investors, because if you have a long-term project and people look at series of contractual agreements over which there are controversy or disputes, it will discourage investment. And here we are in a country that we are craving for private investment. We are calling on foreign investors to come into the infrastructure space because the government doesn't have that much money. We have huge infrastructure deficits, and the plan is that we need to bring a lot more private sector investors on board. The current National Development Plan is about 348 trillion. The value of investment that is expected in the plan. 85% of that investment is expected from the private sector. So if you have this kind of impression, this kind of perception, this kind of reputational problem with the private sector, with investors, how are you going to achieve that kind of private sector investment that is expected, that is anticipated within the framework of the National Development Plan? So this has enormous, profound cost implications, both financial, reputational, perception-wise, which is not good for the economy. So our institutions need to be up and doing. There has to be due diligence, because we have using local contracts. The government has said it is not a good contract. Meanwhile, somebody has put pen to paper to approve it. Many of those cases are in court. Many of the cases of the concession like this negotiated by the concession project are in court with by court means. You have similar cases with the airport, also bordering on public-private partnership, where the government officials are claiming that the content of the contract is not something that they can live with. Meanwhile, those contracts have been signed. So the public sector needs to be up and doing. And unless you also have consequences for those who have committed all this kind, or who have compromised their positions, this kind of thing will continue. Because part of the challenges we have in the Nigerian economy or in public sector governance is the absence of accountability and absence of consequence management. Because if there are sanctions for people who are compromised, then other people will sit up. And it's not just going to compromise because they have been given one or two benefits, personally, at the expense of the country. For me, that is the way to go.
Okay. So let me ask this question. It's probably the $11 billion question. So the lawyers representing the Nigerian government have told Sir Ross Cranston, who's the head of the courts, that P&ID knew from the beginning that there was no deal, noting that it was only a facade to fleece the Nigerian people. And the federal government also says that the former petroleum minister, Rowanu Lukman, and several government officials knew the agreement was a sham and stood to make financial gains. Lukman is dead, but as you said, some of those who are now implicated are facing some form of questioning here in Nigeria. We're not sure how deep that is. But let's go to the worst case scenario, Dr. Yusuf. And that question is now, if Nigeria loses the trial next year and is on the hook legally for $11 billion, is that something that Nigeria can afford to pay? What kind of conversation would we be having in that instance?
Well, it will be very difficult for Nigeria to pay because our fiscal position as we speak is extremely weak. Next year's budget, we are looking at almost funding the budget almost entirely from borrowing. We already have a debt service commitment for next year of about 6 trillion. The deficit is already over 10 trillion. So we don't even have the resources. So if, God forbid, the judgment didn't go in our favor, then we have to sit down with the company and to see how we get around it, maybe work out part of payments or something. That's allowed. Because it's not expected that if there is a judgment debt that has been declared, you have to put all the money on the table from the one. There can be engagement on the structure of the payment, and there can be further discussion even after the judgment. But more importantly is that we should hold people to account.
Yes. And I think that's one of the questions you've already answered. You've mentioned, of course, loss, damage, and consequence and holding people to account. But what do you think the lessons are here for Nigeria? Is Nigeria even learning? There are still questions as right now, as you mentioned, of course, sort of the by Courtney conversation happening, some of the contracts that the country is signing now regarding China. Is Nigeria learning when it comes to contractual obligations? What is in the best interest of the country and its people when representatives are putting pen to paper and putting Nigeria into these deals?
Well, there's no evidence that Nigeria is learning, going by the fact that some of these things have been happening almost in quick succession. And we have not seen any sanctions. We have not seen people being, dealt with. We have not seen people being taken to court, for costing the country this much. So to that extent, I won't say that we have learned. And the whole idea is that if there are no consequences for infraction, similar infractions will happen. As long as people are benefiting privately or personally from it. Those things will continue to happen. Look at what is happening with the oil tax, for instance. Look at how much we are losing, $2 billion on monthly basis over so many years. People are involved in this. Some of them are possibly still sitting in offices. They are offices as we speak. Up till now, I haven't seen any major inquiry set up to find out and identify the culprits in that matter. So it's a reflection of that kind of thing. And this is how a country bleeds. This is how an economy bleeds. And put an economy in such a weak position as we find ourselves. So we have to continue to hold government into account. Happily, election is next year, so the choice is ours as citizens, not just only to vote, but to hold government to account, to demand accountability from government. I think that is what will happen.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Muda Yusuf. We still have a number of months or maybe weeks before this case really hits, but there are a number of people paying very close attention to it, as we also are. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And just a bit more background on that. Let's see if we can give you more about Clause 20, because it's Clause 20 that has actually put this case in London. And the Clause 20 of the gas supply and processing agreements between Nigeria and P&ID talked about, of course, all of this being constructed in accordance with the laws of Nigeria, that in the event of a dispute over the interpretation of the performance of the agreement, and that could not be resolved amicably, then either party will serve notice of arbitration, and P&ID did just that. Then the arbitration award should be final and binding upon the parties. That's not exactly what's happening, because Nigeria is contesting the initial award of the $6.6 billion and interest. Now, the venue of the arbitration shall be London, England, or otherwise as agreed. Nigeria did make some attempts to move the venue from London, involving, of course, high courts here in Lagos, but that did not work. Right now, they're back in the London tribunal and will be facing a court early next year to decide. Now, before we wrap this up, this conversation in particular, let's look at what the whole issue is at the end of the day. An agreement was signed between Nigeria and P&ID, and it was signed for wet gas. There was supposed to be a project built, a plant built. Nigeria was going to supply the wet gas, and then P&ID would have access to the derivatives and a number of other things from that gas. But all of this has blown up at the end of the day, and Nigeria and P&ID are in court. Again, $11 billion billion is on the line. Nigeria saying that officials of government and others were involved in colluding, and they knew that this was a sham contract, raising concerns about Nigeria's ability, of course. So let's finally wrap up with the questions that Nigeria is asking. In papers that have been filed before a London court, there are several questions that Nigeria is asking P&ID to answer. Did P&ID and any individual or company associated with the company make, procure, to be made by any other person, or promise to make payments on behalf of various Nigerian officials? The country is also asking about collusion with and or communication with and or entering into a corrupt agreement with those who might stand to make some kind of gain from this contract. So Nigeria has filed court papers. We've seen what they're saying. We've seen the questions asked. And in the months ahead, many of us will be watching very closely to see how this case plays out.